You touched upon this briefly before, but tell us more about your early research on merit pay and teacher incentives.
Well, I was really surprised to discover that the merit pay, which was surfacing in the 80s, sort of after A Nation at Risk was published, was actually not a new idea. And I went into some of the history and found some of the early accounts of merit pay in the 20s, in 1920s, 1916, major surveys of these large urban districts that were done at the time, and really very humorous accounts of how you would go into a class and there's teacher A who knows nothing and teacher B who seems to know everything, and why should we be paying teacher A more, or, the same as teacher B. So actually, these written accounts could really just go right into the newspaper in the 80s and now again today. And so there was a very strong idea that teachers would be motivated by money to somehow work harder. And I just fundamentally knew that that was not the case. That if you weren't teaching well, it wasn't because you didn't make enough money, or could be, encouraged to work harder and therefore achieve more. It really is that teaching is incredibly complicated and difficult work. And so that was kind of, like many of the things that I've studied, I would reach back to when I was teaching, over those 9 years really, and try to see, is this grounded in the way schools work, in the way teachers think? And so I really just started to look at the history and then try to look at some of the programs that people were using. And what I found and what others have found is that they become very current, lively ideas. For the most part, not created by educators who have other ideas about what would enhance teaching. And then they start to fall away. So there'll be a bonus program for a while, and then the information will get out about who got the bonuses. And there's no validity for the people who see this, And so it kind of faded again in the 80s, and then now with value add has come back as a way of motivating people. For the first time, there is some kind of objective measure, and I say that with all caution,
yes,
of what would differentiate one teacher from another. But again, the research is increasingly clear. This is not an incentive that either increases retention or improves student performance. So I actually think that the most recent research on this should close this down, but I promise you it won't, because there are just people who believe that that is what makes a difference for teachers. People teach because they love kids and they love their subject matter. I've probably interviewed 500 teachers who say the same thing. Very much what Dan Lordy found when he did his research for school teacher. And so when you hear it from that many people, what they say is, again and again, I never expected to get rich teaching. I decided to teach recognizing what the overall pay would be. I have to make enough money to be able to live a decent middle-class life as a teacher, be able to educate my children and be able to have a decent place to live. But that's a whole different set of decisions than how hard I work, how successful I am. And so I think, for me that's done. But I know for other people that will rise again as a strategy. We studied, there was a signing bonus program in Massachusetts that was called the Mass Signing Bonus. And it achieved headlines nationwide because they were recruiting, at that point, mid-career entrants to teaching, trying to get the best and the brightest who'd been in, technology or engineering to enter teaching. And they were going to go through an alternative short fast track program, and they offered them $20,000. And we tracked some of those, and other people have tracked them, and they had to stay 4 years to get the signing bonus. And very few of them stayed that long because they weren't well prepared. Their schools weren't ready to support them, and it really just wasn't enough money. And people thought at the time, this is a fortune.
Oh, sure,
you know, this
sure.
will solve it. So.
Sure. So is there a way to get merit pay right?
I think it depends on what you mean by merit pay. I have a lot of hope about good career ladder programs where actually the professional responsibilities and the pay are aligned. And so I think there is a real problem to not having any expectation that your job will get more interesting, more complicated, more influential if you stay in the same position, and where you can look at a standardized salary scale and see what the maximum is that you can earn. And we've certainly heard that, especially from this new generation of teachers, that that's a real issue. But the answer is not a competitive pay program. It really is creating steps of advancement based on achievements and qualifications that allow you to assume more responsibility for more pay. And there are, Baltimore has adopted in the past 2 years a comprehensive program like that that has totally replaced their standardized salary scale. Cleveland is in the process of negotiating one right now. And so I see great hope for those. But the other, I think, is really just a blind alley.
And which is the current policies in this area that
Yeah,
are defined mainly by test scores and
right.
growth.
Test scores, growth, one-time
Objective
bonuses.
measures, yes.
Sometimes those school-wide bonuses for aggregate value-added scores might be a good thing for the school, but I just really don't think over any period of time they're effective for individuals.
Okay. Tell us about your research on teacher unions and collective bargaining.
Yeah, so I started to tell you a little bit about that. When I did my dissertation, there was really very, very little research. So this was in the late 70s. Very little research about contracts or unions for teachers beyond contract analysis. So some people had done some good work comparing what was in contracts across states and under different state laws, and some analysis of the salaries that were gained through collective bargaining. But really, nobody had gone into schools or districts to say, what difference does this make? There was a great deal of opinion and rhetoric about the evil unions and the bad role of collective bargaining. So for my dissertation, I did go to 6 districts, and that was my question: what difference does it make day to day in schools? Because again, I had this sense that most teachers are very unaware of their contracts. That's not very prominent. They look at the salary scale, they know what they'll earn, but they really don't know what's in contracts. And so basically what I found was that even in a very large city that had a very aggressive union and a very detailed contract, what really mattered happened at the school. And where the principal and the teachers were working together for some common good and understood what they were doing together, the contract played very, very little role in what happened. And where there was a lot of animosity, it could become very prominent. People could file grievances. But even there, most teachers did not see their contract as being the document that would regulate how they did their work. They were there to teach. So that was really the big picture that I got of it. And I have kind of studied unions and then gone away from that and then gone back to it several times. So, so in my dissertation, I learned about the importance of the school in relation to the union. And then after that, I would find an interesting topic related to something that I was doing and go back and look at what was going on with the unions at that time. Recently, I was particularly interested in, as I was thinking about the turnover in the teaching force, that began about 2000, I started to think, well, what happens when the membership of the union starts to shift toward younger teachers? Mm-hmm. How will that change things? And so we did a study along with several students interviewing union presidents, recently elected union presidents in, I think, 6 states, 5 districts in each, and we just did this series of union, kind of exploring the issues with these union presidents. And that was really interesting because what we found was they were basically, as union presidents, leading 2 smaller unions. One of veteran members, many of whom had been involved in organizing the union, who were much more aware of the history of the contract, and were ready to work for the union, and staff the committees and do all the work. And then there were younger members who saw it more as a service organization. They had to pay dues. They had real doubts about whether they needed a union because they already had a contract. They didn't know how collective bargaining worked. And yet, from the president's perspective, if they didn't recruit them as active members, in some states they wouldn't have enough dues, but in all cases they needed them to do the work of the union. Mm-hmm. And so the attitudes of current early career teachers toward unions are much more mixed than of veteran teachers. But then when you have something like the Chicago strike, you see many new teachers basically saying, I understand what this is about. I'm just interested in collective bargaining and unions as a vehicle of teacher voice. And I feel very strongly that teachers' views and opinions can inform schooling in a way that will really improve it for children. And some unions are belligerent and antagonistic and make it really difficult. And some actually maintain very collaborative relationships. So I'm always interested in what happens when things work. And we've studied peer assistance and review programs. These are programs where teachers take responsibility, especially selected expert teachers, take responsibility for mentoring and then evaluating all new teachers in the district, mm-hmm. as well as veteran teachers who are referred because they're struggling. Now, this program is co-sponsored by the union and management. They have what they call a PAR panel, and they get the reports from the consulting teachers about whether someone has improved and met standards. It's actually very, very rigorous. They make recommendations about dismissal or renewal to the superintendent. And in all the districts that have adopted this program, many more teachers are dismissed than they were before it was introduced. So I've done a lot of work very closely analyzing these programs. We created a website that's called A User's Guide to PAR that includes a lot of information and stories from these districts so that others that are considering it can really understand what's involved. So that's the kind of the side of the unions that interests me a lot.
Well, this too is a hot political topic right
mm-hmm.
now on educational policy specifically, or a reform crisis issue.
Right.
Teacher tenure policies, teacher unions, they're onerous, although once considered protective dismissal rules and regulations. They're now widely being blamed for the institutional inertia of our public schools. What are your thoughts on this whole way of thinking about the unions and
Right. This is I have to find a short answer for this one. I teach a whole course in teacher unions, collective bargaining, and school improvement. And in fact, yesterday we were talking about the uses of value added to make many of these decisions. Yes. So it is a long story. I think there's no simple answer to this, but I would point out that Massachusetts is a highly unionized state. Our students do extremely well on the NAEP exam. I do not believe that it's collective bargaining and unions in themselves that make it hard for a district to be successful. I know collaborative labor management relationships in Montgomery County, Maryland is known nationally for incredibly impressive results, and they have an amazingly collaborative labor relations. On the other hand, I can show you places where I think it takes two to tango in this, and it takes two to create a really hostile relationship. So it's possible for it to work well. I am not at all convinced that unions are the problem, or that tenure is the problem. Tenure is actually not part of a collective bargaining agreement. It's in state laws. It began in the 1920s as a way of protecting teachers from discrimination. No tenure, so-called tenure law, gives a teacher a job for life. Any district has within its power the procedures for dismissal, and some places just don't bother. So, I think it's a very complicated story.
Sure, and then now Louisiana has taken tenure down to 1 year based on value-added scores.
Yeah. And we'll see if the schools in Louisiana get better.
We'll see, yes, exactly. When we look at the NAEP scores, we can make our predictions and lay our bets. Your friend and former student, Morgan Donaldson, notes that you're one of the premier scholars in the world on questions pertaining to teachers, careers, the teaching profession, and again, teachers' unions. She adds that one can point to a number of significant accomplishments in your career, including your widely cited book, Teachers at Work. Tell us about your book, Teachers at Work.
This was the first time I really systematically studied the school as a workplace, and I realized that there was, beyond Dan Lordy's Study School Teacher, which is the classic, there really was, and his was a sociological study of the teachers, but there wasn't enough focus on the context of teachers' work. There are bits and pieces of it in many people's work, but I had this idea that I could better understand the teaching profession and the work of teachers if I really understood the relationship of each individual teacher to a context and what they thought of it. So I think there were 115 teachers in that study, maybe 125. They were all identified by principals as being very good teachers. So that was, I wasn't looking for the absolute stars, but just people. The way I described it, I think, was tell me a few teachers in your school who really do outstanding work and who would be missed if they were to leave. It was a focus of what would you lose.
Sure.
And out of that, I selected a group of teachers in a whole array of public and private schools. So religious schools, independent schools, regular public schools. This was before we had charter schools. So the public schools were more kind of traditional, although some of those were alternative within in that setting. And it was a wide-ranging interview, from why did you become a teacher to, what keeps you in teaching, are you thinking about leaving? But a lot of information about how they did their work, how they thought about their work. I had been at Brookline High School when I learned to teach. It was an amazing group of people. And we worked together, we taught together, we watched each other teach. It was just an extraordinary place to learn to teach. So when I got to graduate school and people started talking about the isolation of teachers, I didn't understand it. I then soon observed classes and talked with people and heard about it, where you say hello in the morning and when you get coffee and sit in a faculty meeting, but you don't really work with someone. So I had this sense that it could be all kinds of things. You could actually work very closely with colleagues or not. And I really did, among all those teachers, hear the full range of stories. So I was interested in what is it that encourages people to work together, and what is it that keeps them isolated. And that was really what I was after. As in virtually every study of schools that's done, the principal is absolutely key. On the other hand, the principal can't regulate everything, and to promote collegial relations among teachers is probably the most important thing that a principal can do. And so that book is accounts of the teachers' experiences, and what I did was create a kind of framework for thinking about the school as a workplace. What are the psychological components? What are the economic components? So there's, a chapter about compensation and different kinds of rewards, and another about relationships with colleagues, and another about governance. And again, trying to contrast not only the public and private sector piece, which is a part of this, but also the difference that a school makes. And that focus on the school just keeps popping up for me.
And the school level is really where it's at, would be your argument.
Yeah.
So in terms of all these reforms that are being tossed around, especially at educational policy levels, what was, if you could, make one wish and reform a school, what would be some of the ideas that you'd have?
Well, one thing would be to ensure that the principal or assistant principal, whoever the leadership team is, actually understand teaching. That doesn't mean that the principal has to have taught 7 or 8 years, though I can tell you when they have, it's a whole different level of understanding about instruction and curriculum in the school. But there has to be a kind of respect for teaching and some understanding about how complicated it is. And usually with that kind of respect comes a recognition that teachers actually know a great deal about what will make the school work better. And so principals who are really thoughtful about that rather than instrumental, they have an inclusive approach rather than a kind of instrumental approach toward their teachers, just benefit greatly from the kind of rich exchange that can happen among people as they watch each other teach and as they learn from each other. Isolation is a tremendous problem in schools, and it's driven not just by attitudes, because you actually can have people work on those, but a lot of it is about the scheduling and the demands on people's time. They simply don't have time to do much work together. And so there are ways to get around that. There are ways of pairing teachers. There are ways of scheduling people's time rather than just thinking, about the teacher as widget to fill in this space or another to make the schedule look good, but not to think about what the work is that's going on there. So the selection of principals is really important. And, in high poverty schools, often they are dealing with turnover of teachers because the work context is often not what it could be. And the fact that principals are often placed in these schools who have very little experience, they're new, the more powerful principals tend to get the schools that are humming along. If someone wants to transfer them to another school, if the superintendent wants to transfer them, then it means disrupting the parents, and those are often very influential parents. And so there's a kind of lack of leadership in a lot of the most challenging schools. And when that happens, it's very hard for teachers to be influential. I believe in differentiated roles for teachers, whether it's in a career ladder or, you can release a teacher from one class and have that person do tremendous benefit to the school by connecting people who are working with similar children, or by developing curriculum and helping people use it. There's so much, but the schools were created for efficiency. They one room schoolhouse, and then when you had a little bit bigger, you had one extra room, and the rooms were just kind of built up. And this egg crate structure that Dan Lordy wrote about and that many people talk about is there for efficiency, because then your enrollments drop, you just close one of those classes. So it's not at all designed to promote the interaction of people. And one of the things, as I've been studying schools as organizations, is that I've become very interested in other kinds of organizations. And it makes you realize how bizarre this structure is, because no corporation that wanted to draw the best of all its employees would separate people into little cells, give them their work, and then not give them any time to exchange information. So really focusing on, those kinds of people things. There's a study, a survey study that was done in Massachusetts a few years ago. It's just been re-administered and has been done in a number of other states, developed by Eric Hirsch, and it's about working conditions, and it asks teachers, it's anonymous, a whole array of working conditions, and then the data from that study are put on the web by school. So you can see for each question by school what the responses of the teachers were, if they get a 40% response rate. I was fascinated by that, because what you see is this great school-to-school difference. So along with two of my doctoral students 2 years ago, we were able to get the data and do a reanalysis of it with some of the concepts that we had in mind. What we were trying to look at was what part of these working conditions really matter. And there were two outcome questions that we focused on. One is a kind of Likert scale to response to the question, this school is a good place to teach and learn. So a measure of satisfaction, essentially. And the other one was whether I intend to stay in this school. Sonny Ladd, who's an economist at Duke, has done research showing that when teachers say they plan to leave a school, they actually do. So we could take that and look at, what are the schools where there's going to be a lot of stability and where will there be a lot of movement, and what are the reported working conditions there. And so what we found was that we were particularly interested in high poverty schools, because some people think that the reason there's great turnover in high poverty schools is that the teachers don't want to work with the kids, that they'd rather work with whiter, wealthier children. I had interviewed enough teachers to know that didn't make sense. Surely there are some people like that, but this doesn't explain the level of turnover that we have been seeing in high poverty schools. And so what we did was an analysis of the data from the study, and we found that once you controlled for the demographic factors in these schools, you found that it was the working conditions that determined teacher satisfaction or dissatisfaction. And the working conditions that mattered most, so there were, I think, 9 of them that came out, they were what we call the social working conditions, because number 1 was the leadership. Well, I don't remember the order. I think 1 was the leadership, the principal essentially. The other was colleagues, and the third was school culture. So they were all about how the people work together. Now, whether the roof leaks or not matters, because it conveys certain things to people about how seriously you take their work. But it's that part of schools that interests me, how we draw upon the knowledge, the talents, and support people who have needs to learn new things within a school. I have a very strong view about the current reforms that focus on individuals, and how do we get the very best individuals, and how do we reward the very best individuals, and how do we dismiss the worst individuals. And the problem with that is that in any school at any time, you have some people who are stronger in some things than others. There are people with more experience, there are people with more coursework in a particular area. In an elementary school, there are people who are better at teaching math and others that are better at social studies.
It's complicated.
And so if you can figure out, how to draw on everyone's strengths rather than trying to find the highest value-added score for each isolated classroom, you have much greater chance of improving the school. And what this survey revealed was how important that is to teachers in finding time to work with colleagues, trusting colleagues, and especially in high poverty schools where you really need to draw people together. It's a challenge to be working often in settings that don't get much support from the district that actually sponsors them.
Did they say anything about the ways in which the school leadership or the school in itself approached accountability and how they negotiated through that? Was that one of the indicators?
It wasn't really part, there may have been a question about it, but it wouldn't have been enough to explain that. But we subsequently have been doing case studies in a set of high poverty schools, all under accountability.
Okay.
And really what's so interesting is how much the teachers are concerned about their students' performance, partly to keep the school open because these are schools that potentially the state could close, and it has closed schools. And in part, large part, it's about the kids. I mean, these are people who really will stay at their school for the kids as long as they can. When they encounter a principal who treats them like, little machines somehow that they're supposed to follow a plan, then they often leave for another school. But it's not the children themselves that drive them out. It could be a chaotic environment within the school, and it's, the chaos is the kids are out of control, but that's a whole school that has no set of understandings about how we work together here, no clear expectations. So the accountability is something, a large number of the teachers in high poverty schools have begun teaching since, the late 90s.
Sure.
Accountability has been the water they've been swimming in, and they don't really reject it. What really aggravates them is the amount of test prep that goes on and the amount of time that's spent on testing, 20 days in some schools, and also the very high stakes that are attached to them sometimes, often, in those schools. And statistically, we're doing things now with students' achievement on these tests and with teachers' value add that are fairly controversial. And there's a large and vigorous debate among people who truly understand the statistics. And again, a study by the National Academy of Education, a study by the Economics Policy Institute, by just first-class scholars say don't attach high stakes to these tests. So I think that part of it is painful for teachers because they see what the threat of that does. Now, at the same time, accountability has ensured that kids who are not being taught are being taught. I had great complaints about NCLB, but the one part of it I thought was really important was that every group of students counted, and you couldn't come out with an average student score. You really had to be effective with all these subgroups, and you could see the effect of that within schools that people worried about who would teach them. So, it's certainly not that it's all bad, but I do think we could be more thoughtful and careful about thinking about how to do it. The idea of turnaround is, to my mind, a very kind of primitive idea, because it essentially, out of nowhere, there was an idea that we should replace 50% of the teachers in a school. Yeah. There's no clear reason for that number. And I call it a swap out strategy. We're going to move individuals. And what you find is that unless you think about the entire school as an organization, it's no better. And you have a lot of disruption. So we're going to learn a lot from what's happening right now, but unfortunately, it's doing a lot of damage in some places. So.